Hi, I'm violinist Rachel Barton Pine, and this is Living the Classical Life.
Rachel, we're so thrilled to have you here on Living the Classical Life. You're an internationally touring, award-winning violinist, and we're so lucky to have caught you here in New York City in between concerts. Thank you for being here.
Oh, I'm thrilled to be here and really tickled to discover that you're a fellow Illinoisian.
Oh, yes, my hometown of Champaign-Urbana, and you're from Chicago.
Exactly.
So I'm so curious. You've performed everything from Bach to Metallica and heavy metal. Did you always have such diverse musical tastes from the very beginning?
Actually, I consider my musical taste to be really limited because if it has something to do with the violin, I'm into it. And if it doesn't, I have no interest whatsoever. But honestly, I grew up listening to classical music exclusively when I was a child. You know, whether it was in the car on the radio or at home with the records that my parents would play on the old LP player. But when I was 10, Santa Claus brought me my first transistor radio. And I started scrolling up and down the dial and seeing what else existed out there on the airwaves. And somehow or another, I was particularly attracted to hard rock and heavy metal. And at the time, you know, I was practicing like 8 hours a day, not including rehearsals and coachings and concerts and lessons and everything. And so it was really intense immersion into my classical music studies. And in a way, I couldn't listen to classical music to relax because I couldn't turn off that analytical side of my brain. So listening to some Anthrax or Megadeth or whatever, like I know that doesn't sound relaxing, but it was a way to just chill out and rock out. And it wasn't until years later when I started playing some of this stuff on my own instrument as part of my outreach efforts that I realized, wait a sec, the reason I was particularly attracted to certain subgenres of metal like thrash is because all of those styles are very influenced by classical music, very inspired by classical composition, and actually quite sophisticated in their own structure.
Do you find that your audiences, traditional classical audiences, find that surprising, that you think outside of the box like that? I mean, I would tend to think that most people regard audience goers to classical music as kind of one-dimensional, and they might get offended by metal.
Well, I don't think any of us are there to be offended by whatever any others of us listen to when we're not enjoying symphonies and concertos together, right?
Right.
I think, I'm perhaps the only concert violinist out there who listens to extreme metal, as far as I've been able to ascertain.
You're the first
There-
one I've met, for sure.
But people listen to all kinds of different stuff, and that just happens to be my taste. But I have, when I'm giving concerts, 99% of the time, I'm giving a straightforward classical concert. That's who I am, and that's what I'm about. But as a listener, I love to hear Chicago blues or Scottish folk music or, all kinds of different things. And I love to use the fact that I have these other listening tastes as a way to bring more people into classical music. So my desire is never to kind of do an in-between genre or some kind of crossover thing, but to speak to my fellow rock fans and say, hey, I love rock and classical, and here's why classical is so cool, and come check out the orchestra concert, and you're going to love it too.
I was just about to ask about crossover because I always regarded that type of genre as an attempt to make one style into something that it's not, and vice versa. So you're saying
Exactly.
that you prefer to keep one as
If I'm
classical
going to play
music.
metal, I'm going to play metal.
Yeah.
And not classicize it. And if I'm going to play classical, it can totally stand on its own 2 feet. It doesn't have to be made cool because it's already cool. And the really awesome thing is that a lot of my favorite metal bands listen to and love classical music. And to be able to say, hey, I was hanging out with Dave Lombardo, the drummer of Slayer, and on his iPod, he had it filled with Rachmaninoff, Berlioz, and
No
Liszt.
kidding.
Right? So if the bands you love this music, there's really something to it, and you should check it out.
This is fantastic. I love that. So take me back to the beginning. How did you get into music? How did you start?
Well, I was lucky enough that when I was 2, my parents found a progressive Christian church, St. Paul's United Church of Christ in Chicago. And there's a big music ministry. Our congregation, actually, before it was ever affiliated with UCC as a denomination, was a German immigrant church from the mid-1800s. And we actually have a stained glass window of Bach in our sanctuary.
That's
And every
fantastic.
Sunday morning, it's like movements of Bach oratorios or, preludes and fugues on the organ, just as like the walking in music. And that's just like normal for us, which is, I didn't realize how extraordinary that was till I was much older. So from the age of 2, I was hearing this amazing classical music in my church. And it was in church that I first heard some girls playing violin when I was 3 years old. And I immediately knew that that's what I wanted to do and asked my parents for violin lessons.
Did you in fact come from a musical family?
Well, my mother always sang in church choir, and her mother was a church choir director and a professional soprano. But, there had not been a lot of instrumental playing in either side of the family. My father was the captain of his fencing team at University of Chicago, so I guess I got coordination from him and musicality from my mother or something like that, but nobody ever expected me to be a violinist. It was really my own idea, and they were kind of surprised and a bit taken aback to, because I was so passionate about it. By the time I was 5, I was actually signing my kindergarten papers, Rachel Violinist. And that wasn't just something I did, it was my entire identity. And I was saying, I am a violinist. That's what I had no idea about careers or anything like that, but I was like, this is what I was meant to do with my life. This is who I am. And my mom was like, okay, can she earn a living? Like, what kind of training does she need? And it was a whole adventure, shall we say.
It sounds like you never had any self-doubts about that, but everyone around you perhaps did.
Well, it was a big sacrifice, because my parents were expecting that I would pursue the usual academic type of course in life, and my mom was going to go back to work. And instead, here's my school principal when I'm in the 3rd grade telling my mom to stop having me go to school. Can you imagine a principal saying that, especially back then, before homeschooling was as common as it is now and socially acceptable? So my mom instead had to start homeschooling me so that I could practice as many hours as I needed to. I had made my debut with orchestra already when I was 7, and I was practicing many hours a day, going to lessons at, in high-intensity program, which was off in the suburbs, like an hour drive each way to get there and back. So there was no time to go to school anymore, and ironically, my childhood was actually more normal because I could do my schoolwork during, the drives to and from rehearsal or in the morning over breakfast, and then practice during school hours. And for the first time since I was 4 or something, I finally had a chance to hang out in the afternoon and play with friends. And so it really helped me to not go to school, but it certainly was not the life path that my mom had been expecting for herself.
So you were practicing very avidly for many hours from an early age. Was practicing something that came easily to you? I ask because a lot of my peers and colleagues know that they have to practice a lot of hours, and they wonder whether they should be enjoying it a little bit more.
Well, there's different kinds of enjoyment. I mean, I think if something were too easy, it wouldn't be fun because it's the challenge that makes it interesting. And it's never easy for any of us, but I love the process, maybe kind of like an athlete, the process of, seeing it improve a little tiny bit every day, getting a little faster, a little cleaner, a little more flexible. So I enjoyed that part of it. And, the artistry of it, of course, is the most enjoyable of all, being able to tell a story with the music, express yourself, and then being on stage and sharing that with the audience to uplift their spirits. And that's really something that I got in church, just the idea that playing music is channeling something greater than yourself, and that it's your privilege and responsibility and great joy to be able to then get everyone listening to you caught up in the same feelings so that you can all have this amazing experience together. And so practicing is, the process itself, I have always, I guess, geekily found to be enjoyable. Especially the studying of music, analyzing the scores, researching the history of the composer or the performance practices of the time. Even when I was 6 years old, my mom would take me to the library and I would find children's books on the lives of the composers. So I guess I was a research geek even back before I knew, to go read the doctoral dissertations with all the footnotes. But also just as you're practicing, that the end goal is being on stage. And so you've got that in the back of your mind, and that provides more than enough motivation and inspiration. Now, that's not to say that there aren't frustrations. And, I certainly empathize with anyone who doesn't enjoy the process, because there have been certain things that have been less fun than others, like my up-bow staccato. I was born with absolutely no up-bow staccato. It was like, and I struggled with it for 45 minutes a day for years. And after first 6 months, I was like, and it was like, well, that was faster than where it was 6 months ago, but it's still incredibly pathetic. And it took years before it was mediocre and more years before it was respectable. And I have quite a decent staccato. It's not the best in the world, but I am very proud of my staccato because I know how much hard work went into it, as opposed to other techniques where the first time I tried it, it was like, oh, okay, I can do that.
Do you find that your daily work has to be very structured in order for it to work? Or do you find that your work environment has an impact on how you practice?
Well, that's a great question. Certainly when I was a student, I didn't even appreciate what a luxury it was to have unlimited hours, to be able to be homeschooled and just practice as many hours as I wanted and just indulge in that and practice whichever hours I wanted, whether it was later in the day when I was more awake or earlier in the day when I was fresh, whatever I felt like that day, I could kind of plan it out. As I got older, obviously with touring, you're more restricted because you have your flight and your rehearsal and your interviews and your outreach, and room service closes at 10 and then whatever. Then with my daughter, then I had to become more organized than I'd ever been in my life, because when she was breastfeeding and I had that commitment on top of the usual touring schedule to be able to fit in my practice, it was like, okay, I have 20 minutes right now and I might not feel like practicing, but I better do 20 good focused minutes and then 20 more over here and 20 more over here, and it all adds up to as much as you need to do. But you can't just be like, oh, I'm a little tired, I think I'll check my Facebook for a few minutes. Right? You got to practice when you can. And then, of course, after she was no longer breastfeeding, I thought, oh, now life will be easy. But then she started practicing violin, and I'm
really?
her practicing parent. So now I have to actually organize to fit in her practicing sessions and my practicing sessions. But you know what? It's such a pleasure that I can't look at it like any kind of a pain, because, it's just like, okay, it's a very happy annoyance, let's put it that way.
That leads me to the subject of one thing I often ask about on this show is the loneliness of touring life, but it sounds like you've in fact managed to find time to have a family life. and tour. How is that possible?
Actually, I'm incredibly lucky. It's funny, when I was a kid, like, it was never a question of whether I would marry a musician. It was always, which instrument will my future husband play? And, will it be a cellist? Will it be a conductor? Maybe, hopefully not a trumpeter. But then I ended up actually marrying a non-musician, which turned out to be perfect, because I don't have to, have his concerts conflicting with my concerts or something like that, unless we were going to be in the same string quartet. How would that work? So my husband does computers, and he started out with just him and his laptop, and now he has 20 employees back in Chicago, but somehow with his cell phone and internet, he manages to interface with his clients and with his office and make it work, and he travels with me 100% of the time, which is really brutal when we're in totally different time zones, like Asia or something. He's got to be awake during U.S. business hours and then take a nap and then be with me at my rehearsals and dinner with the conductor and then take another nap, then be back up for U.S. business hours. It's crazy, but you know what? It's so much better than having a marriage over Skype. So we just totally make it work. And it's especially a luxury for what I love to do, because I know a lot of people, when they get married or when they have a family, then they try to be away from home for as few days as possible, maybe condense their rehearsals, do less outreach. For us, it doesn't really matter. So it's I can come 5 days early to the symphony, and I can go and do all the school visits and do all the radio stations and master classes and all those things, because home is wherever my husband is. So every time we get to a new hotel room, it's okay, this is our home this week. And then when we had our daughter, we actually got a nanny from an agency of nannies for traveling musicians.
Such a thing exists?
Yeah, totally, which is brilliant, because it's kind of a process of self-selection. The young ladies that sign up with the agency are looking for an adventurous, music-filled lifestyle. In fact, on her weeks off, our nanny travels. Can you believe that? On my weeks off, I stay home. I'm I'm not going to the airport if you aren't going to pay me.
This must be very expensive, I imagine.
It works, you know what? And whatever kind of childcare arrangement you have is going to cost something. But to have a permanent person who's the same everywhere you go with your child and really knows your child and is a member of the family is just so perfect. And so it's the four of us who go everywhere. And my daughter hit her executive platinum status when she was 2 years old, so she gets her little upgrades to business class. And
that has to be a record.
Hilarious.
Rachel, you clearly have such a passion for stage. What's your relationship with your audience? Do you play to them?
Absolutely. I know there's different ways that musicians talk about it. I remember Daniel Barenboim talking about just being into the music and that the audience will be pulled in. I think it's really just different ways of saying the same thing. But I feel like the reason that I'm a violinist is not just to maximize my own human potential and serve the art, but really more importantly to serve humanity. And the way that I can best do that is through the power of music, because that's the talent that I've been given. And so therefore, it is all about the audience. I'm there to hopefully give them an experience that will be not just a diversion or an entertainment, but something that's going to be, fulfilling and, maybe even life-changing. And it's not really about me, it's about this amazing music that I have the privilege of channeling through to them.
When you're on stage, watching you perform, you always seem to be so in your element. Was it always that way?
Oh, yeah. I'll tell you a hilarious story. So when I was 16, I was playing this concert, Sibelius Concerto with the Montreal Symphony, and there was the radio commentator. I think it was in French, but somebody translated it for me afterwards. And he said something snarky like, "This must have been Miss Barton's first solo with orchestra, or one of her first, because she looked so excited about it." And it was actually my 60th or 70th by that point. And I was like, wait, am I supposed to be less excited to do this the older I get? No way. I'm just as excited today, 20 years later, as I was when that guy made that snarky comment. I think it's an absolute thrill. And no matter how many times I play the same concerto, I go out there and I'm like, oh my gosh, this music is completely amazing. I can't believe I get to do this. I'm the luckiest person in the world.
This is so inspiring. So tell me, what do you tell young musicians who have a problem with nerves on stage, or they're trying to quiet those critical thoughts before the performance or even during the performance? That's one thing I struggle with.
Well, that's such an important topic, and for a long time I thought, gosh, I am the least useful person because I've never gotten nervous on stage. So
wow.
How can I help anybody who does? And then I started getting invited to give speeches. Now, we're not talking about like pre-concert talks where you're extemporaneously, okay, you've got 30 minutes to tell everybody why you love the Tchaikovsky. Okay, no problem. I could go on for 3 hours. No, we're talking about like a 5-minute, structured, prepared speech about the importance of funding arts education or something like that,
Yeah.
in front of a room full of business people, or you know what I mean? I realized, oh, I'm just as capable of being nervous as anybody else.
So that's the first time you felt it.
Yeah, and so I was like, okay, so this is interesting. All the symptoms, the shaky knees, the whatever, the flutters in the stomach. So now, how do I get past this? And I started thinking about what is it that I do with playing the violin that I don't get nervous, and what's different about these speeches that I'm trying to do. So I realized, first of all, experience. Like, there's no substitute for just getting enough times under your belt. But you can kind of artificially fake experience. You don't have to have experience be in front of a real audience 100 times. You can have, a few friends come over and play it for them, and then play it for your grandparents, and then go over to, a retirement home and play it for them. So I always advise people, don't just perform twice a year at your end of semester studio class. Like, go and find, go to your little sister's kindergarten class. It doesn't matter if the Urtex police are not going to be there. So you can play half a movement without piano accompaniment, something you wouldn't normally do because that wouldn't be correct, but just go and play those couple of pages of music, and people are going to love that you're playing something for them. And do your best and just get those experiences under your belt. You can also simulate performance at home, and I did this. My mother was clever enough to think of this when I was a real little kid. I would go into the kitchen like it was the backstage, and then I would walk out into the living room, and all my stuffed animals would be lined up on the couch, and so I would know, which direction was the audience, and then I would shake the pretend conductor's hand and bow. How many times do we actually practice our bows? But you know what?
Right.
It's a psychological trigger. If we get out on stage and we bow, and we only ever bow when we're on stage, we're triggering ourselves to be nervous. If we bow during our practice sessions like a dork, then we're like, oh yeah, I'm used to bowing. This is totally comfortable. I did this yesterday and I played just fine. So, going through the actual routine of smiling, bowing, playing, shaking the pretend conductor's hand again, walking back off stage, then it's that visualization thing they do in sports, right?
Right.
So why don't we do that in music? We should. And then also it's the attitude of, why are we there? What's our purpose? And, like I was talking about earlier with being there to serve the audience, and that it's not about you. Nervousness is a threat to the self. We have that fight or flight, instinct, that fear. But if it's not about the self, then there is no threat to the self. And while in our practice sessions, it's very important that we be ultra critical so that we can try to be as perfect as possible. We have to remember that the audience, except, maybe a couple of jerks, but who cares about them? The majority of the audience has invested their time to come and hear you, and possibly even their money to buy a ticket. They are predisposed to want to enjoy the experience. They're on your side. They're not there to judge you.
I love that.
And so, they're not going to be listening to every little thing. Plus, of course, remember on stage, it's like your ears are under a microscope. And so what you think was, oh my gosh, I flubbed that note, or I botched that run, and then you listen afterwards and you're like, that was almost not at all, that was imperceptible. So you have to be forgiving. It's almost like a psychological switch has to be flipped. Because in our practice sessions, we're listening for what can we fix, what can we improve, what could be better. And then on stage, you have to, without being egotistical about it, but you have to embrace yourself, flaws and all. And you have to say, this is great. I sound good. I'm really enjoying this music. This is fun. And so if the only time we ever try to think that is on stage, we're not going to be used to it. So again, not every day when we're practicing, because that wouldn't be very useful to self-improvement, but every once in a while, maybe once a day or a few times a week in our practice sessions, we have to say, now I'm going to go into performance mode, and I'm going to just play through. I'm not going to try to remember what I need to go back and fix. I'm going to the past is the past. I'm going to only think about what's coming up next. I'm going to just sing this music. I'm going to love what I hear. And getting used to allowing yourself to enjoy what you're hearing actually is a very important skill, because a lot of us feel guilty when we do that. Like, we're not supposed to love what's coming out of our instrument because that would mean we're not a good musician. But in fact, that's not serving our audience, because if we're not quite enjoying what we're hearing, how can they? and we're not there to give them a bad experience. So that doesn't even make sense, right? So it's kind of doing that whole psychological trick. And then, little practical things like put on the outfit you're going to wear on stage so you can get used to feeling those sleeves and those shoes, and that doesn't feel foreign. Make sure you've eaten enough food to have your blood sugar, like don't be nervous and not eat. Have a banana, have an energy bar. Don't have too much caffeine. And just figure out what works for you. Experiment with those mock performances at in your living room, and see, like, do you do better with some slow breathing right before you perform, or do you do better with playing a fast passage from a piece you really love that you're not even performing that night to get your excitement up? So it's just a question of finding what works for you. But I believe that with very few exceptions, everybody can figure out a way to get past fear and to a place of just absolute, joy in their performing life.
You've always been successful at every stage in your life. Did you ever have to face any self-doubts or a sense of pressure that you had to succeed, or a doubt as to whether you could make it as a career? And I don't like to use that word because it's our entire lives, but we do have to make a living. And a lot of my colleagues have a strong worry about whether or not their desire for a life in music will translate to being able to do it.
Yeah, I totally know what you're talking about. And one of the things is that I feel like I just love all of the violin repertoire so much that while I aspired to be a soloist, and not because of the prestige of it or something like that, but I really feel like doing solo repertoire, concertos, recitals, and things like that is the most personal way that I can express my own voice with the instrument. It's just really been where my passion lay. But I never disliked other things. In fact, I love string quartet playing. I love orchestra playing. I even thought it was fun, the couple of times when I was a student and I got to freelance playing in the pit for musicals and operas. I was just like, anything on the violin is fun. And I always, and teaching, oh my gosh, that's like the most joy ever. So I always felt like, if for luck or whatever I don't make it as a soloist, I'll be a concertmaster, or I'll be a professor, or both, or form a chamber group, or, just do all these different things. And so I knew I would make a life in music. I wasn't exactly sure what it would be, but I was never worried that I would be able to, have a life in music. So because I wasn't fixated on one particular narrow career path where if I didn't achieve that particular dream, I was going to be devastated, then I really didn't have that worry. And I think actually it's not only a healthy attitude to have in terms of just, less stress, but loving orchestra so much and having the opportunity to grow up in Chicago with the Civic Orchestra of Chicago as the training ensemble in which I played. That's not a youth orchestra. It's an orchestra for college graduate and postgraduate students who are aiming for careers as professional orchestra musicians. It's, I guess the only other equivalent would be the New World Symphony, slightly different type of organization, but they're really the two that are like stepping stones to, people who are just about to join professional orchestras. Well, I was in the Civic Orchestra starting when I was 11, which was so lucky to be in a town where I could do that. And so we got to work with Zubin Mehta and Daniel Barenboim and George Schulte and Pierre Boulez and Leonard Slatkin and just all these guys coming through, and not just one little masterclass rehearsal, but I'm talking about that they would work with us for 3 weeks and then perform with us. And to get to do that as a kid, and to do all these great symphonies, I feel like, how could I have an understanding of the Brahms Violin Concerto if all I had ever done is been in my room practicing the Brahms Violin Concerto and maybe the Brahms sonatas and perhaps some Brahms chamber music? But I got to do all these Brahms symphonies. I got to do Mahler symphonies. I got to learn about this orchestral music from the inside, from the greatest conductors. And I feel like that impacted my concerto playing so strongly, because what is a concerto? It's a symphony with a violin added. And so to understand something about the orchestra is absolutely necessary. When I did my international competitions in the early 90s, when I was a teenager, I was really proud of the fact that actually I became concertmaster of Civic when I was 14. So that was, a pretty exciting accomplishment.
That's
and
cool.
I was advised to leave that off of my bio when I went to the international competitions in Europe.
Why do you
because
think that
they'd be
was?
like, well, you shouldn't be advertising that you're an orchestra player when you're at a solo competition. And then the conductors would always be like, wow, I can really follow you so easily. And it's kind of like, well, duh, that's because I know what I'm doing with an orchestra. So, yeah, very ironic.
Yeah. Have you had a lot of chances to play in an orchestral setting as a member of the orchestra rather than as a soloist?
Well, there's this whole thing where, a soloist will play their concerto on the first half and then sit in the back of the section on the second half. But these days, I think it's so important to be able to make yourself available to the public, to talk to kids who are learning instruments, to talk to adults in the audience who come to your concert. My favorite is when somebody comes up to the autograph table and says, this is my first ever classical concert in my life, and I loved it. And I want to be there for them and talk to them and thank them for coming to my concert. And you just can't be in two places at once. So I'm always out at the autograph table during intermission as well as after the show, and there's just not enough time to get back on stage and then rush back out to the lobby. And so I've had to give up playing the symphonic repertoire. But who knows, maybe when I'm 90 years old and decrepit, I'll sit in the back of a community orchestra and play the Mahler symphonies one last time.
What was it like being a child prodigy? That comes with a whole bunch of pressures all its own.
Yeah, well, it's interesting being a parent now. My daughter started violin lessons, and I always tell parents that literally when your kid is 30 years old on stage playing the Mendelssohn concerto, all that matters is, do they have something meaningful to say about it? And nobody's going to care if they didn't learn it till they were 12 as opposed to the other person's kid who learned it when they were 8. Maybe the person who didn't learn it till they were 12 has the more beautiful interpretation at age 30. So it literally doesn't matter. It's the same thing with, is your baby crawling at age 6 months or age 8 months? It seems like some big deal, but, maybe the one that didn't crawl till 8 months is going to be the Olympic sprinter. You know what I mean? It's like silliness. So that's one thing, but having been very advanced myself at a very young age, I actually really disliked the prodigy sort of label, because I was really serious about music when I was young. I guess I was just kind of a geek, and I just wanted to be a good artist. I wanted to be good, period. I didn't want to be good for my age. It really didn't matter to me. It almost seemed silly. And so, I really was always striving, for how can I be better, and, how can I just have a profound interpretation that's better than how I played that same piece last year, and that sort of thing. The one way, though, that I was grateful to, a couple of ways that I was grateful to be advanced quickly was, first of all, it enabled me to do more fun things sooner. I mean, I didn't have to wait till I was 16 to play the Shostakovich quartets. I could play them when I was 12 because my chops were there. You know what I mean? So getting your chops going means you can do more repertoire, which is just really, just so much fun. But also, because my father was unemployed for most of my childhood, I was able to start doing, not just the solo concerts and the competitions and all of that type of young artist activity, but able to do adult freelance jobs on the side, playing background quartets for weddings or pickup orchestras or other kinds of gigs to help my family out financially. And I was really able to start doing that in a major way from age 14 onwards, which was very helpful to my family. So, I was very grateful for that I had gotten good enough soon enough that I could start to help in that way.
Being a young musician is so expensive with all the lessons, the conservatories, the instruments, the bows. What do you tell musicians who are worried about the finances?
Well, if they're a string player, I say apply to the Rachel Barton Pine Foundation. It was so difficult when I was a kid. Our phone and electricity would be being turned off all the time. We'd be one missed payment away from losing the roof over our heads. And it was like,
No
okay,
kidding.
how are we going to purchase sheet music and put gas in the car to drive to your lessons and pay for groceries? It just seemed impossible. And to actually have the irrational faith to hold on to the dream that, and the belief that I was meant to be a violinist in the face of these seemingly insurmountable odds almost seems crazy when you look back. And there was nothing like my foundation when I was a kid. And so luckily there were different patrons and different supporters, family, church, etc., who helped us out and enabled me to, get where I needed to go. And so I felt like the best way to honor those who helped me would be to help the next generation. And we have a unique program called Grants for Education and Career, which identifies young artists and students who are very gifted, are motivated to build a life in music, and are also very financially struggling. Essentially, poor prodigies, to use the prodigy word.
Yes.
And we pay for things other than lessons, because you can usually get financial aid at the institution where you're studying, but how do you pay for concert clothes? I mean, we used to go to the thrift store and get an old bridesmaid's gown and try to fix it up for my concerts. It was, really ridiculous. And, so concert clothes, airfare to competitions, audition recording sessions, even paying, for the gas tolls and parking to come to your lessons in, the big city if you live somewhere a little bit farther away from where your teacher is. Bow repairs, new strings for your violin, sheet music, piano accompanist fees. All of those things are out-of-pocket expenses that traditional scholarships don't cover. And yes, you can be lucky enough to win first prize in a music contest, and then you have some money. But what if you only win second prize or honorable mention? That's still a huge accomplishment, but it doesn't come with a lot of, net income. So my foundation has really stepped in to fill that gap. We've supported more than 70 young artists at this point. We also have an instrument loan program with everything from a 1732 Stradivari down to fine handmade contemporary instruments and fractional sizes. And it's been just the greatest blessing that through the help of our many supporters that I've been able to help other young artists in need.
You've had success after success in your career. What has been the most challenging aspect of your musical life so far?
Well, there's fun challenges, like learning to play the 12-string viola d'amore.
Did you have to learn how to do that?
Well, I didn't have to, but
Yes.
I thought it would be fun, so I decided to embark upon it. Actually, I think I might be the only modern concert violinist who plays the viola d'amore. I guess I'm the weirdest of them all. Oh, it's such a gorgeous instrument. It was, yeah. Well, anyways, or when I decided that I wanted to play all Paganini's 24 Caprices in a single evening's concert.
And you did that as well.
Yeah, which was at first like a physical feat, but then it turned out to be this amazing artistic exploration of actually the bel canto style and the musical variety to the caprices. Because after a certain point, it's like, okay, now I know I can play the notes. What is the point of doing them all in a row? It's so that the audience can explore the amazing palette of colors that he created with the violin. So anyway, those are fun challenges, and there's always more around the corner, and I'm always seeking them out. But of course, when it comes to career and things like that, there are always challenges of what decisions should you make at different junctures in your life and things like that. And of course, 20 years ago when I had my initial recovery from my injuries, then I had the challenge of not being able to travel for a period of time and losing a lot of the engagements in Europe that I had been booked for. Some of which were never able to quite be recovered. But you know what? I never look back on the past and think what might have been. I'm always a very positive person, and I always am looking towards the future and excited about the future, and just grateful for all of the enjoyable things that I've been able to do and been able to give. And so that's really where I'm coming from. So
That's an incredible story of hope, that you were able to transcend those difficulties. What did you learn about yourself?
Well, actually, in a sort of a way, I feel like what I went through during my childhood when things were so tenuous with my family, that being able to hold on to my hope and belief and faith that, God had given me this talent, and this is what I was meant to do with my life, even if I couldn't see how it could possibly work out based on, current circumstances. That having that and seeing that, yes, indeed, it did work out, that somehow when there were other challenges or other obstacles along the way, it was like, okay, this also seems impossible, but even though I don't know how it's going to work out, I know that it will, and I just have to continue to hold on to that faith. So I don't feel like, any of my medical difficulties were as transformative as people might think that they were because of what I had experienced as a kid.
Are you optimistic about the future of classical music?
Oh, totally. In fact, I heard you talking to somebody else in one of your, it was the beginning of your interview with Zool. And you said something about all of this stuff about,
Right.
classical music is dying. And now, I am a real student of music history. Like, I love nothing better than to like read a treatise from the 1700s, or, a dissertation from the 1930s, or a biography from a violinist of the 1800s. Like, I am a total research nerd, right? So people have been saying that classical music is dying for more than 50 years. So if it was true then, how come we're still here now? So that kind of makes me, suspicious of people saying it now, because they've been wrong before. They seem to have been saying it all along. Also, I'm married to a statistician. So I'm like, okay, how are we cutting the data here? Is it based on fixed numbers? Is it based on percentages? Is it based on demographics? You know what? We tend to look at orchestras. Oh my gosh, an orchestra in such and such a town has folded. Well, that town has 4 chamber music series and an early music group and a new music series, and it had none of that 30 years ago. So yeah, its orchestra might have just folded, but there's all this other classical stuff going on. I always look on the bright side, and I think, classical is never going to take over the world. Just as more people will always go to an action flick than a Shakespeare play. But there's always going to be room in the world for what we do. And I think also that no matter how secure and successful classical ever is, that we can never rest on our laurels, because there's always people who haven't yet discovered it. And I think it's the greatest stuff, and that anybody who doesn't have classical in their life is really missing out. And so it's our mission to not only play the concerts that we're booked for and we're paid for and we're scheduled to do, but to find ways to go out and creatively engage more listeners, to introduce people to classical, not out of a sense of self-preservation, of trying to make sure that our art form still exists in 10 years, but out of a sense of it's my responsibility and the mission of my life to bring this music to people, because it really gives them something that they're not going to get from anywhere else, that there's something special about classical. But also to spread the word that there's a lot of variety to classical. And the same person that loves going and hearing a Beethoven symphony might not be the same person who wants to go and hear a period instrument and Renaissance music concert, or a new music concert, or a string quartet concert. You don't have to like all of classical to like some of classical. And there's definitely some variety of classical that's going to speak to you, and you have to find out what that is, and to help lead people on that journey. I think it's absolutely thrilling, and I'm just really excited to see where the next generation is going to take classical music, with so many, young, entrepreneurial, innovative young people. I mean, I think it's actually great that we can't all graduate conservatory, go and get a job in an orchestra, have a manager that books us a recital tour. It would be nice and comfortable if that were still the way it existed, but honestly, it's not like, things have gone downhill. I think that was a temporary blip. It's like the dot-com bubble or something. You know what I mean? Because it wasn't like that before. People used to have to hustle back in, the 1800s and the early 1900s. It was only comfortable for a brief slice of history. And I think things are more creative when they're less comfortable.
One of the purposes of this show is to help aspiring musicians. I'm wondering what you tell young musicians. I don't think you've had this problem before, but for the young musicians who might be going through a motivational slump, what can you offer them?
Oh, well, I really do think that in terms of motivation, first of all, there's short-term goals, right? Like, I want to get ready for this recital, or I want to learn this piece, or I want to finish this piece so I can learn this other piece I really want to start, or I want to get better at my thirds. But also, I think it's important when you're young, playing these instruments, the level of technique that's needed to do the great works of art has risen so much. It's so demanding. It's like, we're Olympic figure skaters nailing our triple jumps or something. Unlike other genres of music where if you're a little sloppy, it adds flavor. With classical, that's just not going to work. We have to be able to have good technique, period. So all of that, practice, that physical practice, for someone who's not necessarily of an athletic mindset, who's, artistic but doesn't love that part of the work, it can be very grueling, and I totally get that. So how do you motivate yourself in the face of that, in the face of very gradual progress? First of all, I think it's really fun to record yourself and then not listen back. I mean, recording yourself and listening back is useful in the moment when you're trying to hear, be your outside ear, right? So that you can listen without executing and see how the phrasing is going or see what your intonation was or things like that. Of course, I highly recommend that. But listen, set that track aside, don't listen to it. And then listen to it a month later so that when you feel like, oh, I haven't improved at all, listen to how you sounded a month ago and go, oh, wait, I sound a lot better. Because the progress is so gradual that you yourself sometimes miss it. So that can be really heartening to do that. Also, build in small amounts of motivation. When you have a little kid and they're practicing, sometimes you say, okay, if you do your twinkle, 10 times in a row, really focused, I'll let you have a shiny penny or something unrelated. You can do that as a grown-up. You can say, okay, I'm going to have a piece of chocolate if I do that annoying passage of fingered octaves 10 more times. I mean, we never get too old for those sorts of motivations. But you can also motivate yourself musically. I think the level of perfection that we demand of ourselves, technically and interpretationally, it can be almost overwhelming to us because we can never achieve our ideal. It's not humanly possible. And so we're always going to come up short. We're always going to be disappointed with ourselves. And how do you get past that? So to build in some creativity to your practice sessions, whether you're a student or a professional, to say, okay, I'm going to take the last 10 minutes and jam along with a favorite song from the radio or try to write a composition that I'm never going to let anybody else hear, but I'm going to just indulge for myself. Or I'm going to do some improv or play a fiddle tune or just do something wacky. And do that and don't judge yourself because actually a lot of those things it's like you're going to stink. So there's no question about you stinking. So there's no pressure. And you're just going to mess around with it and have fun and do something creative. First of all, actually, you probably don't stink as much as you think you do, and you're going to be improving yourself. And also, doing something creative every day is going to help you listen to your classical music with new ears. You're going to be a little more spontaneous and not as judgmental about, is my phrase perfect, and is it what I meant to do with the colors? But instead, you're going to be like, what do I feel like doing today? And something unexpected is going to come out. And indulging in some of the improvisatory types of playing, even if that's not what you really do with your art, it'll really benefit your classical playing. So I can't recommend that highly enough, just kind of getting away from it and jamming out, rocking out, and then going back to it. And I think it can be so healthy, and actually doing that with old pieces. After we graduate from Suzuki, for example, we no longer, maintain those review repertoire kinds of concepts. We don't play all of Book 2 every day anymore. So what does it mean we're practicing? We're always practicing a new piece that we don't quite know. We're only playing things that we don't quite play well. Well, of course, one can always continue to improve, but at a certain point you do polish a piece and you do play it quite well at a certain point. So why do we then pass it and move on to the next piece? That's actually quite unhealthy. Every day we should be playing something we play well. So I'll often take an old piece of repertoire that's not scheduled for any of my upcoming concerts, but it's something that I love, something that I know I do well, and I'll just play it so that I'm playing something on the violin that sounds beautiful, that I can feel good about, while I'm struggling to learn that new concerto or get back something I haven't played in a long time or reinterpret something I'm not quite satisfied with. I'll keep practicing the piece I just played last week, even though the concert's over, because I know I got it to a point that I was happy with. So I'm going to play it for the first 20 minutes of every practice session so that I feel good, and then play the piece that I'm not quite satisfied with yet. You know what I mean? So you've got to do those things. And somehow, the older we get, the more we forget to do them, but they're just as healthy for us, at every stage of life.
Rachel, do you prefer the stage to the recording studio?
Absolutely. I think probably most musicians would say the same thing. There's nothing like just the energy from the live audience and the inspiration that you get, that no matter how many thousands of hours you were to practice that piece, somehow things occur to you on stage that come out in a way that you would have never envisioned if the collective human energy wasn't all there working together. So I really do feel like audiences are not merely observers, that they're somehow participants with the vibe that they're feeding back to the performer. Recordings are really fun too. It's a totally different art form. Certainly there's repertoire that I would really never get invited to perform very often that I can share with people because I've put it on album. There's ways
Such
that you
as?
can, well, like the Franz Clement violin concerto. That was the violin concerto that directly influenced and inspired the Beethoven concerto, actually served as a model for it. I made the first ever recording of this concerto, which is a great piece in its own right, but sheds new light on the beloved Beethoven violin concerto. And so that was like musicologically interesting, but also so artistically fulfilling. And being able to do those things, but even just plain old standard repertoire, like the 5 Mozart violin concertos that I recorded with Sir Neville Mariner, I got to do my own cadenzas and collaborate with this amazing conductor. And, you know, there's a way in recordings that you get to capture your ideal, you know, what you envision for the piece. Even in a great performance where everything is perfect, there's a difference between perfect and ideal. So maybe, you know, there was no out of tune note, no moment of bad tone. So there were no mistakes, but in a recording, you have the ability to say, okay, I played this phrase beautifully 3 times, but which one was the most beautiful? And we're going to put that next to the most beautiful of the next phrase. And so you have this thing that's almost inhuman, but is capturing what's in your heart about the music. But of course, missing that spontaneous aspect of something that you might not have already thought of. So 2 different art forms. What I'm really excited about also is the ability that recordings have to kind of live on, you know, past you and influence people in towns that you've never yet visited. Of course, YouTube is great for this, but my next recording, the Bach Sonatas and Partitas, I'm actually simultaneously releasing my edition with the music publishers Carl Fischer. And I'm not only including bowings and fingerings, as with most editions of the Bach, but also every single phrase marked with dynamic hairpins, which aren't really dynamic, they're more phrase shapes. So it's a lot of clutter on the page, and I certainly wouldn't want anybody to emulate every single detail of what I do. I'd want them to find their own answers. But I think having all of my ideas on the page for people is going to be an opportunity for me to essentially teach all these young violinists that maybe I haven't coached on Bach in master classes, and yet here I am giving them this edition. And so I'm just so super excited about that.
Rachel, thank you so much for being on the show. It's been such a pleasure and an honor.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. It was fun.
Yes.